What's up, everyone? Hope you're doing well today. I'm excited to be talking with you again this week from Genesis, which is a really cool book of the Bible. There's so much in here. The velocity of narrative is like fast and slow and medium and fast again, then fast for a long time, then slow for a long time, covering huge swaths of time, but then also dialing back and really focusing on detail. So it's just a really cool story to dive into. It's got pretty much everything the entirety of the Bible has. It's got prophecy and poetry and history and narrative. And so I love Genesis because it's kind of a microcosm of so much of the rest of the Bible, and it points to what's going to be happening in the rest of the Bible. It truly is not just a genesis of world events, but it's also a genesis, meaning a beginning of the entirety of the collection of works we know as the Bible. And what we're going to be studying today also has two side points that I came across as I was kind of studying into this and as I came across this story. And so we're going to be looking at one specific story, but the way that I found it made me kind of inspired to maybe share this with you a little bit. It's two things that in our examination of the Bible, we need to not refrain from doing. We need to not neglect these things. And it's two things that I often do neglect. And so this is why I'm motivated to share it with you, not because I think I'm great in this, but actually because I think I'm not so great in this. And these two things are what I want to go over first, and they have to deal with Bible study. Or the opposite of Bible study, kind of. And the first thing is that I'm hoping that we are not neglecting our Bible reading. And I know that these things seem kind of to go hand in hand, right? When I'm studying, well, I'm also reading the text, and that's true. However, reading is fairly distinct from studying in that while I'm studying, I'm going through kind of line by line. I'm comparing things one to another. I'm looking across chapters and seeing where the patterns are. I'm looking into individual words and seeing what they mean. I'm trying to draw out. It's almost like reading is not quite as like wringing the towel for any moisture you can. It's just kind of a general appreciation of the text. So when I'm reading, I'm going to pick up on different things than I will when I'm studying. And this is something that I think is really important because so often I think, well, I study my Bible pretty regularly, so I'm fine. But on the rare occasion that I choose to just sit down and read the text and just kind of let my mind wander over the words, there are different things that are pulled out. And I really, really love those things because I find them much more naturally. It's not like, the work is good. You know, when you are studying the Bible, the work is good. It should be enjoyable. It should be fun, should be engaging. But it's just not the same as just, like the original audience having the Word of God read to them, which is also why it might be good to get like an audio version of the Bible and just to hear it, because that's a different form of intake, and you're going to be pulling different things from that as well. But as I was looking through Genesis, I was preparing for a message for church, and I just came across this little section that I wasn't really looking for, but my mind was caught by it. And I think this is kind of an opportunity for God to work in your mind. He is kind of working with you. I believe I have the Spirit of God in me, and I pray before I study, before I read, before I come before Him and approach His Word. And so, it might be that there are times where you're reading and God just kind of highlights things for you in your mind. Now, I'm not saying it's always supernatural. It could just be a curiosity or, something very natural, but it opens the door. It opens the door for God to do something or communicate something to you in a way that might not normally happen when you're trying to go through line by line, little by little, and really find the minutia of what the text is saying. That's a really good practice. Don't neglect that either, but don't think that, well, just because I've studied today, that I've also just read today. Both might be valuable. So don't, scorn one for the other. Don't only do one. Practice both as often as you can. And I'm going to do the same because truly I study way more than I just read, but I think that there is something so profitable about just letting your mind wander over the stories that are being told to you or the lessons that are being told to you. And that's how I came across this today. The second point I want to make, I probably dug up so many holes in that one, just really put it to rest, kind of like shooting a dead horse. But, the second point that I want to make today is that there are going to be times in the Bible where you're going to get kind of bogged down. Maybe it's place names or genealogies or hard to pronounce words or kind of just aside details that don't really make much sense to you, not having lived in the land of Israel or the surrounding area. If it says this person traveled from this place to this place, well, it's very possible that all the author is trying to do is try and kind of frame your reference or put the story in a frame of reference that the original audience could understand. And it doesn't hurt you to go and look up those things and say, okay, yeah, interesting. He traveled from here to here. I kind of get it now. But there might not be some broader lesson. However, there are times where I do believe the author is intending to not just give you a geological location, but to communicate something greater. And so when you come across these names, there are going to be times where you're like, nah, I'm just reading right now. I'm just going to kind of, flow across the page and I'll look that stuff up later. I'm not feeling it. And that's okay. It's not a big deal. But if ever something catches your eye and you think, that's a strange name. I wonder what it means. I wonder where it is. Don't neglect that. Look it up, because there might be times, like we're going to study today, where God is trying to show you something specific that you won't get if you don't kind of understand the geography just a little bit. Not saying you've got to be an expert in geography or in place names or locations, but we have so many resources at our disposal. It doesn't hurt if your mind is kind of, if your ears are perked up to something, your metaphorical mind ears are perked up to something. Look it up. It might be something really cool, like we're going to see in today's story. Hopefully you find it interesting. I do anyways. And so now we'll get into our story. It's a pretty brief one, but I think it's so important. It has to do with Abraham, the father of the faithful. Really interesting person. This is kind of right at the beginning of his story. He's called out of his homeland. He is brought into kind of the wilderness, and he's showing a display of faith. He's trusting in God. He's leaving everything he knows to pursue something he doesn't know. And there is an act of faith involved in this. I mean, he is accredited for this moment for being a faithful person, as he did for the rest of his life pretty much, especially in his sacrifice of Isaac. But early on in his calling, he leaves his homeland, goes into the wilderness, and there's a famine. He ends up going into Egypt, which is such an interesting thing because Moses is writing the Torah, the law, the first 5 books, and he's kind of telling the people of the Exodus, hey, look at this pattern. We just were in Egypt. We had all these things happen to us. There was a famine, and that's why the children of Israel ended up going to Egypt after Joseph was there. And, we've had all these things happen. Look at Abraham's story. It's the same exact thing. And the parallel goes even further because the wife of Abraham, or it's Abram at this time, Sarai, she's taken by the Pharaoh, and God sends plagues on Egypt. Well, that sounds exactly like the children of Israel, who are the bride of God, going into Egypt, being taken over by Pharaoh, and then God sending plagues on Egypt to bring them back out. That's exactly the same thing that happens here. But after this section in Genesis 12, we have Genesis 13, where Abraham and Lot separate. And God says this really interesting thing just to Abraham in verse 14 of chapter 13. It says, "The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted." So, pretty general blessing here. We've seen this. If we study the Bible for any length of time, we realize this is kind of the Abrahamic promise that is given to all of his descendants as well. But this is very interesting because it deals with the land specifically. It says, look on the land, walk across it, northward, south, or actually, sorry, it doesn't say walk across it till 17. This is what we're going to get into. But it says, look across the land to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west. I'm going to give you something. And he says, arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. Okay, so this is interesting. God says, walk throughout the land. It's almost like the Lion King, where Mufasa tells Simba, anything the light touches. And that's kind of what he's saying here. Like, go walk through the land that I'm giving you, north and south and east and west. He's kind of telling him to not just survey the land, but to walk as far as he can and all the land that he steps upon will be the land that God gives to him. But it says he stops at the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. Now, this is still really far south in Israel. So he went from south in Egypt into the land of Israel, and he walked a little ways, but he's not even as far north as Jerusalem, which is still part of the southern kingdom of Judah in the later years. So Israel has so much more northern territory that Abram never even walked to. And you have to start to wonder, why did he not walk as far north as he could? Like, why did he settle here? It could be for a number of reasons. We're not told in the text. But if we don't know that this is a southern portion of the land, then we just see that, well, God said, arise and walk, and Abram walked, and he settled somewhere. That's all we get. But when we realize that God had promised him a much greater area of land, and Abraham was supposed to walk through the land in order to kind of signify where the promise extended, or where the promised land extended, and we see that he settled kind of far, far south, we have to ask questions. Why did Abraham do this? Was it a humility thing? Did he walk so far and think, well, this is all that I need? Or did he walk to a place that he found desirable and thought, man, if I could just have this, I'd be so happy to have even this? Or maybe he didn't trust. He's like, oh, well, it can't be farther than this. Surely, I've already walked a long way. This is plenty. Remember, Abraham is only a few people. His tribe here is only a few people. Abraham and Lot have separated. And so even now, his group, his clan that's moving around with him might not consist of even half the people that it did just before this time. So Abraham is a small group, or a small family, and he thinks, yeah, okay, God's going to bless me. That's great. He's going to give me some land, but this is enough room. And so he stops. So again, I don't want to impute motivation because I truly don't know Abraham's motivation, but it's worth noting that he starts in the south of Israel. He travels a short distance north, not even as far up as Jerusalem, and he stops and he settles. Now, this sets the scene for the very next thing that happens that I think is so fascinating. Right after this, in chapter 14, Lot gets taken captive by some kings or some rulers, and Abraham hears about it, and he pursues. He takes his band of people that he has with him, and he pursues up all the way into the land of Israel. And it says, interestingly, that he pursued them to rescue Lot all the way up to Dan. Now, if you're aware of, biblical geography, you'll know that Dan is like the northernmost city in Israel. That's why in the Bible, when they say from Dan to Beersheba, that means all the way from the north, all the way to the south. This is kind of an all-encompassing term. It'd be like saying, I live in Ohio, it'd be like saying from Cleveland to Cincinnati. Like Cleveland's all the way up in the top right or east of the state, Cincinnati's down in the bottom west, and it kind of encompasses the whole land. It's just two cities in the northern and southern portion of the area that indicate the markers of the land. And so, interestingly, Abraham starts in the very far south, and God says, walk out the land, and I'll show you what I'm promising you. And Abraham gets to a certain spot all the way in the south still, and he stops. Then he has this trial come upon him where his family is taken captive. And so he goes in pursuit of them. And I'm sure he's thinking this whole time, man, I followed God out of this land, or out of my homeland, away from my family. The first thing he does is I'm experiencing plague. But okay, fine, he brought me out from that. Great. Now he says, I'm going to promise you all these things. Wonderful. But now my family's taken captive. It's like he had trial after trial while he's following after God. But what's interesting here is that he goes all the way up to the northernmost city in what would be the land of Israel that God was promising him. And so God uses this trial, it seems to me, of Lot being captured to kind of force Abraham to move where he needed him to. He told him, walk out the land, and Abraham stopped short. And so God sends a trial, which, yes, is not fun, it's not enjoyable, but it actually leads to Abraham traversing the whole length of the land, which would be promised to him. You have to wonder, if Abraham had stopped and not pursued Lot, would God only have given him from Beersheba here to Hebron? Would that be what God did? Because he said, walk out the land that I'm promising you. And he didn't. So anytime you're going through a trial, this is kind of the practical part of it that I took away from it. Anytime you're going through a trial, it can be so tempting to think, well, it's kind of a shame that God's not with me in this, or I know he's with me logically, but I don't really know what he's doing this for, or what is he trying to teach me? Yes, trials are for teaching. That's great. But here we have a very clear evidence of the fact that sometimes our trials actually might lead us to greater blessings, and not just lessons learned, but they might be provocation, God pushing us to go in a direction that he needs us to go in order to bless us more fully than either we think we deserve or we trust him to deliver on. So this is the story of Abraham that I think we might skip over often, but I do think it is so applicable to our lives. So I'm sorry if you're going through a trial. I'm sorry if you're going through a hard time. Definitely pray about it. I mean, I don't think God has your ill will in mind at all. He loves you. But so often our trials are so hard to feel that love in. But just remember, like in the story of Abraham, it might be God pushing you towards greater and greater blessing that might exceed your expectations or the trust you're able to have in God right now.